In the ancient kingdom of Nhazunde, there existed a secret bloodline so rare, they were whispered about only in the darkest corners of the night. They were known as the Ibata. They did not strike metal with hammers, nor did they use fire to melt weapons. Instead, they possessed a forgotten spiritual science. They could speak to the iron. They could feel the movement of or beneath the earth and bend the bones of the world with their minds. But they were not an army. In the entire kingdom, there were only a handful of them alive. They kept to themselves, acting as silent protectors of the land, believing their gift was a sacred bond between man and the earth. Everything changed when a ruthless conqueror took the throne of Nhazunde. He was a king driven by greed and a thirst for blood. He saw the rare power of the abata not as a blessing, but as the ultimate weapon. He summoned the few living abata elders and commanded them to use their gift to wipe out the existence of the neighboring peaceful tribes so he could claim their lands. The elders refused. They told the king that the iron was pure, and it strictly forbade them from shedding the blood of the innocent. Enraged by their defiance, the king did not argue. Instead, he sought out a dark and powerful sorcerer. Together, they formed a wicked conspiracy to wipe the abata from the face of the earth. The sorcerer used dark magic to track the unique vibration of the iron in the blood of the abata. One by one, the metal benders were hunted down, captured, and executed in the dead of night. The bloodline was being erased. But as the grand elder of the abata was struck down, he spoke a final prophecy with his dying breath. The iron will sleep, but it will never die. The lineage will survive the fire, and the earth will remember. That very night, the prophecy took its first breath. A terrified young abata mother, carrying her newborn daughter, fled deep into the unforgiving forest. She could hear the footsteps of the king's hunters and feel the dark magic of the sorcerer closing in on her. She knew that as long as she held her baby, they would both be found and killed. In a heartbreaking sacrifice, she wrapped her infant in a woven cloth, kissed her forehead one last time, and hid her deep within the roots of a giant irako tree. The mother then ran in the opposite direction, making noise to draw the hunters away from her child. She was caught and killed, but her sacrifice worked. The baby was safe. The next morning, the abandoned infant was found by a poor, ordinary farmer passing through the woods. Having no children of his own, he took the baby girl in and raised her. She grew up with absolutely no knowledge of her true lineage, her history, or the heavy magic that slept silently in her veins. Years turned into decades. The girl grew into a woman, married an ordinary man, and had children of her own. Those children grew and also had children. The ruthless king grew old and died. The dark sorcerer faded into myth, and the terrifying hunts became nothing more than forgotten campfire tales. The world believed the abata were extinct. Then, in the third generation from that surviving daughter, a boy was born. His name was Okeli. To the rest of the village, Okeli was just a quiet, ordinary boy. But beneath his skin, skipping generations of silence, the ancient bloodline is about to awaken. As Okeli grew from a boy into a young man, he was known throughout the village not for violence, but for his gentle heart and respectful behavior. Yet, there was an invisible force pulling him toward the heat of the fire. Without knowing why, he became an apprentice at the village forge. In just a few years, Okeli became the finest blacksmith in the entire kingdom of Nhazunde. People traveled from distant lands just to buy his plows, shields, and swords. His blades were perfectly balanced, and his tools never broke. What the villagers didn't know, and what Okeli himself didn't fully understand, was that he wasn't just striking the metal with his hammer. When he closed his eyes, he could hear the iron humming. He was unconsciously guiding the metal with his mind, shaping it as easily as a potter molds wet clay. He thought it was just a natural talent, completely unaware of the ancient abata blood flowing through his veins. But peace in Nhazunde was a fragile thing. The grandson of the ruthless king who had wiped out the abata now sat on the throne, preparing for a massive, greedy war. This new king sent his brutal royal guards to every village to forcefully collect all forged weapons, farm tools, and iron. When the royal guards arrived at Okeli's village, they showed no mercy. They kicked down doors, raided the forges, and loaded carts with every piece of metal they could find. Okeli, being a man of peace, stood back and watched them take his life's work. He did not fight. But then, the arrogant captain of the guards noticed a small, rusty iron pendant hanging around the neck of Okeli's grandmother, the very same woman who had been found abandoned under the Irako tree decades ago. The pendant was her only connection to a past she never knew. The captain grabbed the old woman, violently snatching the pendant from her neck and throwing her into the dirt. Seeing his grandmother bleed, something inside Okeli snapped. It wasn't just anger. It was an ancient rage waking up from a deep sleep. He stepped forward, standing between the captain and his grandmother. The captain laughed, drawing a massive, heavy steel sword. Without hesitation, he swung the blade with all his might, aiming straight for Okeli's neck to make an example of him. The villagers screamed and covered their eyes. Okeli had no weapon. He simply raised his bare hands in a desperate attempt to block the strike, bracing himself for death. But the cut never came. Instead, a deafening, ear-piercing screech of tearing metal echoed across the village square. Okeli opened his eyes. The captain's heavy steel blade was hovering just 1 inch away from Okeli's bare palm, vibrating violently. The captain pushed with all his strength, veins popping from his neck, but the sword would not move forward. Then, Okeli took a deep breath. As he exhaled, the solid steel blade began to groan. Right before the eyes of the terrified guards, the sword curled backward, twisting upon itself like a dying snake until it shattered into pieces, falling harmlessly to the dust. Absolute silence fell over the village. The captain fell to his knees, trembling in pure terror. Okeli looked down at his own hands, his heart pounding like a war drum. He didn't know what he was, but in that moment, the secret was out. The earth had remembered, and the abata had returned. News of the impossible event in the village square spread like wildfire, carried by the terrified whispers of the royal guards. Within days, the whispers reached the grand palace of Nhazunde. When the young king heard that a blacksmith had shattered a steel sword with his bare hands, his blood ran cold. He remembered the dark journals of his grandfather. He remembered the prophecy. The Ibata bloodline had not been entirely wiped out, but the king was cunning. He knew that sending an army to capture a man who could control weapons might end in disaster. Instead, he set a deceptive trap. He sent royal messengers to Okeli's village, not with chains, but with gold. They delivered a royal invitation, claiming the king had heard of Okeli's unmatched skill and wanted him to become the supreme blacksmith of the royal court. Okeli, a man of peace who only wanted to protect his family and village from the king's wrath, accepted the invitation. But when Okeli walked into the grand throne room, there was no forge waiting for him. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him, and he found himself surrounded by the king's elite guards, holding weapons made of carved bone and heavy wood, materials his metal-bending gift could not control. Sitting on his throne, the king smiled a wicked smile. It was there, in the cold hall of his enemies, that Okeli finally learned the truth of who he was. The king mocked him, telling Okeli the dark history of the Ibata. He told him about the ancient sorcerer, the Great Massacre, and how Okeli's ancestors were hunted down like animals because their power was a threat to the crown. "You are not a blacksmith," the king sneered. "You are an abata, a cursed demon of the earth. And tonight, your bloodline ends forever." Overwhelmed and surrounded, Okeli was beaten down by the wooden clubs of the guards. He was dragged into the deepest, darkest dungeon beneath the palace and thrown into a massive cell forged from thick, solid iron. The king thought he was clever. He believed the heavy iron would break Okeli's spirit. But the king had made a fatal mistake. You do not lock an abata inside a cage made of their own element. In the dead of night, as the palace slept, Okeli sat bleeding on the cold stone floor. He closed his eyes and stopped fighting the pain. Instead, he listened. The iron cell wasn't a prison. It was speaking to him. It hummed with the same familiar vibration he had felt at the village forge. Okeli stood up and placed his bare hands flat against the thick iron bars. He didn't just push, he commanded it. The dungeon trembled. The massive iron bars began to glow slightly from the heat of his energy. With a deafening screech that shook the foundation of the palace, the unbreakable cell door violently burst outward, twisting and tearing like wet paper. The guards rushed down the stairs, but Okeli didn't even look at them. With a single wave of his hand, their iron armor locked up, freezing them in place. Okeli walked out of the dungeon and vanished into the night. Knowing he could never return to his village without putting his family in danger, Okeli fled across the borders, seeking refuge in the neighboring kingdom of Mazuri. But the king of Nhazunde was just like his grandfather, obsessed and ruthless. He placed a massive bounty on Okeli's head, sending his deadliest assassins, trackers, and bounty hunters across the border to finish the job. Yet, in Mazuri, Okeli did not hide in the shadows. He embraced his destiny. He saw villages suffering from poor harvests because they lacked tools, and towns left defenseless against bandits. Okeli stepped out into the light. With nothing but his focus, he pulled raw ore from the dirt and shaped it into perfect farming plows for the poor in a matter of seconds. When ruthless bandits tried to raid a Mazuri village, Okeli simply stomped his foot, and a massive, impenetrable wall of iron shot up from the earth, shielding the people. He didn't use his power to conquer. He used it to build, to protect, and to heal. The people of Mazuri were in awe. They didn't see him as the cursed demon the king of Nhazunde claimed he was. They saw a savior. They welcomed him into their homes, fed him, and protected him from the Nhazunde assassins. Whenever the king's hunters came looking for the metal demon, the people of Mazuri stood together, hiding him and chasing the hunters away. For the first time in generations, an abata was not hunted. He was loved. Okeli had become the silent guardian of Mazuri, the man with the earth in his veins. But the king of Nhazunde was not a man who accepted defeat. Furious that his assassins kept returning empty-handed, he decided to handle the metal demon himself. He gathered the full, terrifying might of his army and marched across the border, bringing war directly to the peaceful gates of Mazuri. And the king came prepared. Learning from the dark journals of his grandfather, he armed his frontline elite soldiers not with steel, but with heavy hardwood clubs, carved bone spears, and sharpened obsidian stone. He knew the secret. Okeli could not bend what was not metal. As the massive army surrounded the village of Mazuri, the king stood at the front, his chest puffed with arrogant pride. He pointed his carved wooden spear at Okeli, who stood alone in front of the terrified villagers. "Your magic is useless against the trees and the stones," the king shouted, his voice echoing across the valley. "Today, the Ibata bloodline dies forever." Okeli did not run. He did not beg. He simply walked forward, his bare feet pressing firmly into the red African dirt. The king was right. Okeli could not bend their wooden shields or their bone spears. But the king had forgotten one crucial detail. He had forgotten what lived beneath his feet. Okeli closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and slammed both his palms flat against the ground. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, the earth began to shake. A low, terrifying hum vibrated through the soles of the soldiers' feet, making their teeth rattle. Suddenly, the ground split open. Massive veins of raw, unrefined iron or shot out of the soil like dark lightning. Okeli didn't need their weapons. He had the entire earth at his command. With a roar, Okeli swept his hands upward. The raw iron or tore out of the ground and formed a massive, swirling hurricane of sharp metal. The dark storm of iron ripped through the king's army, snapping their hardwood spears like dry twigs and shattering their bone weapons into dust. The air was filled with the deafening sound of grinding metal. Panic gripped the Nhazunde warriors. Realizing they were fighting a power they could not comprehend, the soldiers dropped their useless weapons and ran for their lives. The king, abandoned by his army and terrified by the godlike power he had awakened, fell to his knees. The iron storm swirled inches from his face. Okeli walked slowly up to the trembling king. He did not strike him down. Instead, he pulled a piece of raw ore from the air and bent it into a heavy, unbreakable iron collar. locking it securely around the king's neck without even touching it. "Go back to your empty throne," Okeli commanded, his voice echoing like a hammer on an anvil. "And tell them that Mazuri is protected. Tell them the earth remembers." The king fled back to his kingdom in disgrace, and for the rest of his days, Okeli remained the silent guardian of Mazuri. He was no longer a hunted outcast. He was a living myth, a man whose power kept the kingdom safe from any invader for generations. Centuries passed. The kingdom of Mazuri eventually faded into the sands of time, and the story of the man who could command the bones of the earth became a whisper, and then a myth. Today, when we sit in movie theaters and see a man wearing a helmet, lifting submarines from the ocean, and bending metal with his mind, we call him Magneto. We think of the X-Men. We call it a brilliant piece of comic book fiction. But legends are rarely born from nothing. Before the comic books, before Hollywood special effects, there was the red soil of Africa and a bloodline that could speak to the iron. So, the next time you watch a mutant control magnetic fields on your screen, remember the name Okeli. Remember the true, untold story of the ancient African metalbender, whose real-life legend is far greater than any movie script.